The fresh morning air carried with it the distinctive smell of pine and damp earth. Sarah always felt at home in nature, especially on days like this when the national park seemed to exist solely for her. There was something comforting about the solitude of the trails, the soft sound of dry leaves crunching beneath her feet as she moved forward, camera in hand, ready to capture the rare autumn flora. The soft sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a play of shadows that turned the forest into a living gallery of colors and shapes. It was exactly what she sought, inspiration. However, even amidst this serenity, something inside her felt uneasy. A familiar feeling, like a cold breeze running down her spine. Sarah, always meticulous in her preparations, had ventured there alone. She did this often, but that morning, as she traversed the dense path, a question occurred to her. How well do we really know the places that make us feel safe? Nature was wild, unpredictable, but the real threat might not only be among the animals. Sarah shook her head, pushing away the thoughts that tried to distract her. The park was safe, well monitored. It had always been that way. Yet, as she walked deeper into the trail, the discomfort didn't leave her. Her instincts screamed, but she ignored them, focusing on the camera and the next shot. It was then that she noticed something strange by the side of the path. Footprints. They looked fresh, much more recent than any she had noticed earlier. Sarah frowned, stopping for a moment to observe them. Maybe it was another hiker, she thought. After all, it wasn't uncommon to encounter people there, although during the week, the trail was less busy. She adjusted the camera strap and moved on, trying to shake off the growing feeling of being watched. As she advanced along the winding trail, Sarah kept noticing the footprints, each time closer. Trying to stay calm, she continued taking pictures, seeking to distract her mind. But the reality was hard to ignore. The footprints, initially sparse, now seemed to follow her at an unsettling distance. She remembered passing through that same section minutes earlier and hadn't seen any signs of another person. She was alone, or at least, she thought she was. A pang of anxiety began to rise. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a faster hiker heading in the same direction, or even someone who had left the trail for a while. Taking a deep breath, Sarah tried to calm herself. Her heart, however, began to beat faster, and the forest that once brought her peace now seemed to close in around her. She paused for a moment, checking her phone. The signal was weak, only a small, indicating the possibility of communication. Another wave of anxiety hit her. I forgot to tell someone where I'd be today, she thought with slight panic. Normally, she was careful, informing friends or family about her trail plans. But that morning, in the excitement of capturing the perfect images, she simply forgot. The park was safe, she told herself. But now, with fresh footprints behind her and the cell signal faltering, that certainty began to crumble. The sound of snapping branches echoed in the distance, and Sarah froze in place. Her eyes scanned the forest around her, but she couldn't see anything beyond the tall, dense trees. The gentle wind rustled the leaves, creating a constant, almost hypnotic sound, but the snaps were different. Clear, like careful footsteps trying not to make noise. She picked up the pace, still trying to rationalize that it was just animals or nature itself moving. But the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave her. Her heart was pounding now, each crack of branches echoing louder in her mind. The terrain ahead of her began to incline slightly, and Sarah knew the trail would become more challenging from that point. The sky, once clear, was now covered by dark clouds that hinted at an imminent weather change. There was no sign of other hikers, and the trail grew increasingly deserted. She needed to decide, continue forward or turn back before the rain came and the trail became dangerous. She took another photo, as if this could distract her from the growing discomfort. But deep down, she knew she was just delaying the inevitable. The feeling of being watched, the strange sounds, everything seemed to combine to form a warning sign in her mind. Sarah stopped again to adjust the camera's focus, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The park had always offered her a sense of peace, But now she began to question whether she was truly safe. Her feet, once confidently moving through the terrain, now hesitated with each step, as if the nature around her had turned into a treacherous maze. The lake appeared in front of her like a sudden vision. The calm surface reflected the cloudy sky, and the shores were surrounded by trees whose branches seemed to form a natural dome over the water. Sarah, still feeling the adrenaline of the moment, decided to stop and calm herself. She approached the lake's edge, kneeling to fill her hands with the cold, crystal-clear water, hoping it would clear her mind and soothe her. The silence around her was almost absolute, except for the sound of water dripping from her fingers. When she stood up, something caught her attention. A subtle movement, a brief glimmer in the water. Her eyes fixed on the distorted reflection on the lake's surface, and her heart nearly stopped. There, among the trees on the other side, stood the figure of a man, standing, staring directly at her. The reflection wavered with the water's movement, but it was unmistakable. He was at a considerable distance, but close enough for her to know she was being followed. Sarah instinctively stepped back, her body paralyzed by a mix of fear and shock. Her mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just another hiker. But the way he stood there, motionless, watching her, didn't seem normal. Without thinking much, she grabbed her backpack and began moving quickly along the trail, veering off the main route. The idea of shortening her hike to avoid direct confrontation led her to a secondary trail, even more isolated and less frequented. But by doing so, Sarah distanced herself even further from the safety of civilization, entering unknown territory where the terrain was steeper and more challenging. The trees around her became denser, the intertwined branches almost blocking the daylight. The terrain ahead was rocky and uneven, making each step harder and amplifying her sense of isolation. Sarah's heart raced as she constantly glanced over her shoulder, hoping not to see anything but, at the same time, fearing what might emerge. The reflection of the man in the lake was a confirmation that she wasn't alone. The forest, which once seemed peaceful and welcoming, had now turned into a maze of invisible dangers. Then, as she rounded a sharp bend in the path, she noticed the ravine. The steep rocks ahead blocked her route, and the path behind was once again closed off by dense trees and vegetation. She had nowhere to run. Sarah pressed herself against a large rock, trying to control her breathing and think clearly, but the sounds of slow, heavy footsteps began to echo, growing closer. Every snapped twig or muffled sound seemed to amplify her fear. She knew she couldn't just wait there. Her body was tired from the running, but fear pushed her forward. The only way out she saw was to use the terrain to her advantage. Her eyes quickly scanned the rocks, looking for a solution. Then, an idea formed in her mind. Without thinking twice, she grabbed a large stone from the ground and, with all the strength she had left, threw it into the vegetation, creating a loud, sudden noise. The footsteps stopped for a moment. Sarah took advantage of the pursuer's hesitation and ran to the opposite side, where the rocks formed a small opening. But the price of this sudden escape was high. She had to abandon her backpack with her valuable photography equipment. Leaving her camera behind, something so important to her, was a huge sacrifice. But at that moment, it was the only way to gain speed and distance from the danger. Lost amidst a whirlwind of thoughts and physical effort, Sarah kept running, feeling the weight of fear in her tired legs. The forest seemed endless, and the sense that the pursuer was still nearby made her every move more hurried. She was disoriented, the ravine behind her and the increasingly treacherous terrain ahead. But a spark of hope ignited in her heart when, after several minutes of aimless running, she saw something different. What seemed to be a clearing. She approached, now out of breath and nearly giving up, when she noticed the movement of other people. A group of hikers was in the distance, casually chatting as they followed the main trail. Sarah forced herself to move toward them, almost collapsing from exhaustion, but determined to reach safety. When she finally reached them, she could barely speak, only pointing behind her, trying to explain what had happened. They helped her calm down, and soon the park authorities were notified. Sarah, though physically safe, was still emotionally shaken by what had happened. She looked at the forest around her, the same forest that once comforted her, and felt a chill at the thought that, amidst the trees, the man who had followed her was still there, untouched, uncaught. The park, however, was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Sarah questioned her decisions about having trusted so much in the safety of the environment. Despite everything, she knew that the feeling of relief would be temporary and the mystery. The winding mountain road seemed to stretch forever, but Emily felt her anticipation grow with each passing mile. The silence between her and Mike was only occasionally broken by the hum of the car engine. She gazed out the window and smiled as she saw the horizon, with the trees beginning to thicken around them. This is it, she thought. They were finally arriving at the remote campsite she had found in an adventure blog. Are you sure this is a good idea? Mike asked for the third time that morning. He had never been a fan of camping. A corporate lawyer, his idea of a perfect vacation involved 5-star hotels and luxury spas. But Emily convinced him that a few days away from the hustle and bustle of the city would be good for both of them. After all, the beauty of the mountains, the fresh air, and the distance from technology were exactly what she needed to disconnect. Mike, on the other hand, was not convinced. It's going to be amazing, she said with a confident smile. You just have to give it a chance. When they finally arrived at the campsite, Emily was delighted with the view. A calm lake reflected the distant mountains, and the dense forest around them made the place feel untouched. The isolation was obvious. No cell signal, no sound of cars or planes, just the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. They set up the tent in silence, with Mike still visibly uncomfortable. While he busied himself with the fire, Emily took one last look around. Something about the silence of the place made her feel a twinge of nervousness, but she ignored it. This was exactly what she wanted: peace and quiet. Night fell quickly, and the campsite was engulfed in almost total darkness. Only the flicker of the campfire illuminated the space around the tent. Emily nestled into her sleeping bag, satisfied with the day. Mike, on the other side of the tent, fiddled with his useless phone, trying in vain to get a signal. I told you there wouldn't be any service here, she said with a chuckle. Mike sighed, irritated, but didn't reply. In the middle of the night, when the fire had long since gone out, Emily was awakened by a distant sound. At first, she thought it was the wind in the trees, but soon she realized it was something else. A voice. No, 2 voices. An argument. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, trying to pinpoint where the sounds were coming from. She looked at Mike, who was sleeping soundly beside her. The voices grew louder, and now she could distinguish muffled screams, as if someone was in danger. Mike, she whispered, shaking him slightly. Mike, wake up. He opened his eyes slowly, confused. What is it? Did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. It sounds like someone is screaming. Mike was silent for a moment, listening carefully. The voices became clearer, followed by a sharp scream that cut through the night's tranquility. Then, everything went silent again. Emily remained sitting, her eyes fixed on the direction the sound had come from. She was alert, her body tense. Mike, still trying to process what he had just heard, rubbed his eyes and shook his head, visibly uncomfortable. The silence following the screams was disturbing, almost tangible, as if something sinister was lurking in the darkness around them. We need to check what's going on, Emily insisted, her voice low but firm. Someone might be hurt. I'm a nurse, Mike. I can't just ignore this. Mike sat up straighter, but his face showed concern and hesitation. Emily, what if it's dangerous? We don't know what happened, and we're in the middle of nowhere. It could be a fight, or worse. She knew he was right to be cautious, but something inside her, her instinct to help, was pushing her to act. What if it's serious? What if someone needs help and we do nothing? I can't just sit here. Mike looked out at the darkness beyond the tent, his face contorted with anxiety. What if we get involved in something bigger? We can't call for help. There's no signal. Nothing. Maybe we should wait until daylight, see if things calm down. Emily bit her lip, struggling between reason and the impulse to act. The idea of waiting until the next day seemed sensible, but the screams still echoed in her mind. What if it was too late? Still, the fear of the unknown, of what might be waiting for them in the darkness, made her hesitate. All right, we'll wait until morning, she reluctantly agreed. Mike nodded, relieved, but the discomfort gnawed at her. Dawn brought a pale, cold light to the campsite, and with it, an even greater sense of unease. Emily had spent most of the night awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, tense at every noise. Mike, on the other hand, had slept fitfully, but was still exhausted. As soon as the sun began to illuminate the area around them, Emily got up, determined. We need to check out the other campsite. I can't just let this go. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Mike sighed, knowing he couldn't talk her out of it. They followed the dirt path through the forest, the silence between them broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the soft ground. The forest seemed denser during the day, as if the weight of what had happened the previous night still lingered. Every tree, every shadow, seemed to hide secrets they shouldn't uncover. When they arrived at the neighboring campsite, the feeling that something was wrong became even more apparent. The small clearing was in complete disarray. Tents overturned, sleeping bags strewn across the ground, belongings scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. On the ground, dark stains caught Emily's attention. This isn't right, she whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. As she got closer, she realized it was blood, dried and smeared on the ground in one of the sleeping bags. Nearby, a silver necklace gleamed in the dirt. Emily picked it up, trying to process the scene. Whoever had been there had left abruptly and violently. Mike glanced around, uneasy. Emily, I think we should leave. This doesn't seem safe. But Emily was absorbed, examining the scene, trying to piece it together. Something much darker than a simple couple's quarrel had taken place here. Emily held the necklace in her hands, her fingers absent-mindedly fiddling with the pendant as her mind processed what they had just found. The neighboring campsite wasn't just a mess. It was clear evidence that something violent had occurred. The blood, the scattered belongings, the oppressive silence. It all pointed to something far more sinister than either of them could have imagined. Mike, standing next to her, glanced nervously around, feeling an increasing pressure to leave as quickly as possible. Emily, we shouldn't be here. This is wrong. We need to leave now. She looked up at him, still hesitant. Part of Emily knew Mike was right, that they had no idea what they were getting involved in, and that maybe the only sensible decision was to leave the place and seek help. But at the same time, her sense of duty pushed her forward. As a nurse, she felt responsible for those who might be injured. What if someone's still here, Mike? What if they need help? Mike sighed, his eyes fixed on the bloodstains on the ground. And what if we end up being the next victims? Emily, we don't know what we're dealing with. We have no cell service. We can't call for help. We need to get out while we still can. The tension between them was rising. Each one defended a point of view that, in a way, made sense. But it was impossible to deny that both of them were terrified. They finally decided to leave the area and head to the nearest town to call the authorities. However, the idea of abandoning possible victims without gathering more information haunted them. As they began packing up their own belongings, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The soft sound of wind through the trees seemed to hide something else, a presence, perhaps, or simply the fear that now gripped them. As they returned to their own campsite, Emily and Mike noticed something was wrong. The belongings they had left neatly organized were now in disarray, as if someone had rummaged through their things during the night. Emily's heart raced. She approached the backpacks, rummaging through them quickly. "Someone's been here," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Mike looked around, his eyes scanning the trees around them. "This can't be happening," he murmured, almost to himself. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the distant sound of branches breaking under unknown feet made them both freeze. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her voice tight with panic. Mike closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "We're going to do what we planned. Leave here without raising suspicion. We'll pack what we can, but quickly. We need to get out now." They began dismantling the campsite at a frantic pace, trying not to seem desperate, though the adrenaline was evident in their movements. The sound in the forest around them seemed to get closer, which only increased their urgency to leave as soon as possible. Emily forced herself to stay calm as she packed the evidence: the silver necklace, some photos she had discreetly taken with her camera, and the bloodstains they had found. Finally, with everything ready, they walked away from the campsite, trying to act naturally, but every step seemed to echo in the silent forest. As they moved farther away, the fear that something was following them grew. Every snapping branch, every rustling leaf in the wind made them look back, expecting to see something that would confirm their worst fears. When they finally reached the car, the feeling of relief was immediate, but not complete. Even so, they knew they weren't safe yet. They left the campsite area, but with the awareness that someone, or something, had been watching them closely all night. Emily and Mike drove in silence along the winding road back to town. The tension between them seemed to have dissolved with the adrenaline of the moment, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. Emily held the necklace tightly in her hand, as if it were her only connection to the mystery they had just left behind. When they finally arrived at the local police station, the cool morning air enveloped them, but it brought no relief. They told the officers everything they had witnessed: the screams, the blood, the scattered belongings. Though skeptical at first, the police promised to investigate the campsite and send a team to the area. Hours later, back in the comfort of civilization, Emily felt the weight of the previous night finally begin to settle on her shoulders. While they were on the road, everything seemed urgent, desperate. Now, with the distance from the danger, fear had given way to confusion. What had really happened there? And more importantly, who had rummaged through their belongings during the night? The couple checked into a small nearby hotel, unable to go straight home. There was something incomplete, something still hanging over their heads, a feeling that the mystery was far from solved. They tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. A few weeks had passed since the incident, and Emily tried to return to her routine. However, every time she thought about it, a shiver ran down her spine. She wondered if the police had discovered anything, but had heard no news since then. It was on a quiet afternoon that doubt turned to terror. Emily was home, alone, organizing her belongings when she heard the familiar sound of a notification on her phone. Picking it up, she saw an anonymous message. "What you saw that night was just the beginning. Don't come back." Her heart stopped for a second. The message contained details that only someone who had been there that night could know. The screams, the necklace, the movement in the forest. Emily froze. Whoever had sent that message was still around, and knew far more than they had imagined. We had been planning this hike for weeks. Everyone needed some time away from the routine, and the forest seemed like the perfect place for it. It was one of those days when the sky was so clear that even the birds seemed more active. The sound of our footsteps echoed on the dry leaves beneath us, and the fresh air enveloped us, carrying the damp scent of wood and earth. We were a group of 5 friends, laughing and joking, until we realized that the path we had been following was no longer as clear as before. The trees, which had once seemed distant and sparse, were now closing in around us. We began to follow a path that seemed right, but at some point, we realized we no longer saw the markers that had guided us so far. That initial moment of excitement quickly dissolved, replaced by a growing sense of unease. No one wanted to admit we were lost, but the looks we exchanged said it all. Should we go back? Lucas, the most cautious of the group, asked, his voice trembling slightly. Back to where? Clara retorted, looking around. Everything here looks the same. I tried to stay calm. After all, we were adults and had phones with GPS. But the signal was weak, almost non-existent, and the night was falling faster than we had expected. A cold breeze cut through the air, and for the first time since we had started, I realized how dense and terrifying this forest could be when the sun was no longer on our side. As night fell, our steps became faster and more anxious. We needed to find some shelter, and quickly. That was when Clara spotted something between the trees, a wooden structure partially hidden by the vegetation. We approached, and to our surprise, it was a small cabin, worn by time and poorly maintained. The windows were broken, and moss grew along the rotting wooden walls. It looks abandoned, Pedro said, hesitant, while examining the structure. We don't have a choice. It's either this or staying out there, I said, trying to sound confident, but even I knew it didn't seem promising. We pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, revealing a dark and stuffy interior. There wasn't much inside, just an old fireplace and some dusty furniture. We decided that this would be our refuge for the night. At least in here, we'd be protected from the cold. We lit a small fire with the little wood we found nearby, and the warmth of the flames brought a bit of comfort. But despite the makeshift shelter, the atmosphere around us was oppressive. The silence of the forest was unsettling, and the sound of the wind against the trees only intensified the feeling of isolation. We were all there, sitting around the fire, but no one could fully relax. Something didn't feel right. We were sitting around the fire, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The crackling of the wood was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The cabin, which initially seemed like a refuge, now felt suffocating. The air was dense, and the night seemed colder than it should have been. That's when we heard it. At first, it was a distant noise, almost imperceptible, something that could easily be mistaken for the wind in the trees. But soon, the sounds became clearer. The sound of tires on dirt and dry leaves. And then, voices. It was impossible to understand what they were saying, but they were there, like whispers carried by the wind, getting closer. Did you hear that? I asked, trying to keep my voice low. Yes, Clara responded, her eyes wide. We all looked around, but nothing was visible. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding the cabin. We were trapped, not knowing who or what could be out there. It must be some group of hunters or something, Pedro said, trying to rationalize it, but his voice betrayed the fear he felt. The voices continued, accompanied by distant footsteps. No one dared to move. Whatever it was circling us, getting closer with every passing moment. Panic began to take hold of us. Something told us we were no longer alone in that forest. The sound of voices and footsteps didn't stop. What had been a mild annoyance was now a full-blown siege. We were being circled, that much was clear. With every second that passed, the voices seemed closer, more threatening. The broken windows of the cabin gave us little protection, and we were all tense, waiting for something or someone to reveal itself. We need to get out of here, Lucas said, his fear evident in his voice. We can't stay trapped in here like rats. And go where? It's worse out there, Clara replied, her voice trembling. I knew she was right. In that darkness, any attempt to flee would leave us even more vulnerable. But the idea of waiting here, surrounded by invisible voices, was terrifying. I could feel everyone's fear growing, feeding into the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. Pedro, always the skeptic, stood up. Maybe it's just a group of people wandering around. We're not really surrounded. We need to check. Are you crazy? I replied, standing up. We're not opening that door. What if there's no one? It could be our imagination. Pedro insisted. The argument escalated. I tried to stay calm, but the tension between us grew with each passing second. The voices outside were undeniable, but no one knew what they meant or what they wanted. We were cornered, and panic was about to consume us. That's when the knocking began. A dry, firm sound on the cabin door. Everyone froze. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The voices stopped, and now there was only the sound of the knocking. We were being challenged, and the decision about what to do next could determine our fate. The knocking continued, each one more insistent than the last. The sound echoed through the cabin, each knock a reminder that we were not alone. The panic was palpable, and for a moment, no one even dared to breathe. Pedro, however, couldn't take it anymore. He stood up suddenly, his eyes fixed on the door. "We can't stay here, hiding like cowards. If it's someone needing help, we need to know," he said, a mix of frustration and fear in his voice. Before any of us could stop him, he marched towards the door. "No, wait," I shouted, but it was too late. With a loud, creaky groan, the door slowly swung open. We all held our breath, waiting to see what was on the other side. But to our surprise, there was no one. The darkness of the forest stared back at us, impenetrable and silent. A cold wind swept past us, making the trees whisper, but there was no sign of movement, no visible presence. Only the marks of tires and footprints in the damp soil, like scars left by the night. What is this?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide. Pedro took a few hesitant steps outside, looking around as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. But the void remained, heavy and suffocating. "It doesn't make sense," I murmured, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Whoever had been surrounding us had vanished without a trace, but the feeling that we were still being watched lingered. We spent the rest of the night in silence, unsure of what to do. No one had the courage to leave the cabin again, and even Pedro, who had initially wanted to explore, quickly returned inside and locked the door once more. We stayed awake, on alert, every sound outside making us jump in fear. Finally, dawn brought a relief that felt almost surreal. The sound of birds singing and the soft glow of sunlight broke the heavy silence that had hung over us. The forest, which during the night had felt like a living nightmare, was now just a sea of harmless trees. We decided it was time to leave. As we stepped out of the cabin, we saw the marks that confirmed our worst fears. Human footprints and tire marks surrounded the area. Someone had been there all night, watching us. But now, all that remained were the signs of what could have been. As we walked away from the cabin, a sense of relief mixed with the weight of what we had experienced washed over me. I still looked back at that small wooden structure that seemed so harmless in the daylight. I knew that night would stay with us forever, a reminder that, in the darkness, the true terror is the unknown. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed the stories, leave a comment. Your feedback is really important to us. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.